Pacers making moves. Kendall Brown waived, Jahlil Okafor in and out. Plus then a long conversation with Pat Boylan about the Pacers' upcoming season, expectations, continuity, and then a little bit on the Indiana Fever and Caitlin Clark, all on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Thursday, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers, as always. My name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we have to dive in. Pacers made some moves yesterday, 2 days ago when this is out. Guys have been waived. The roster's looking like it could be set for opening night, but maybe not. We'll get into why all of that is the current reality. Plus, then Pat Boylan's going to join us for about a 25-ish minute conversation about the Pacers, continuity, expectations, and then, as we do every year with Pat, because he is the TV voice of the Fever, we talk some Caitlin Clark and the Fever and the parallels between the Pacers and Fever, where those franchises are headed. But first, we got to do a short segment on the Pacers moves. We talked about the roster battle earlier this week because the Pacers had to make those decisions sooner. And if the playing time wasn't enough, it felt very obvious where this was headed. I said this at the time. The Pacers waived Kendall Brown on Tuesday. He was in the mix for the 15th roster spot, but I mean, of those paying attention for a while, he earned the roster spot last year. He was solid enough on his two-way. He got to play in some playoff games, but his summer league was not good, which left some doubt about should he be on the team. His contract's not guaranteed for this season. They brought in Cole Swider, which suggested they certainly thought there should be something potentially different going on with that last roster spot. And then throughout camp, throughout these preseason games, Cole Swider sometimes playing 15 to 20 minutes, Kendall Brown barely getting in until the last 5. It felt very obvious what the Pacers' ranking of their back end of the roster was between those two guys. They waived Kendall Brown Tuesday, 2 days before their final preseason game. And Kendall Brown, 2-year career at the Pacers, second-round pick in 2022. Who knows where this goes if he doesn't have a shin injury and he can actually play more down the stretch of his rookie year when the Pacers were giving opportunities to their younger players, but just didn't ever show enough material skill as a passer, creator, shooter, any of that. He showed some defensive progress that I was encouraged by in his first season, but not enough to stick around, right? And the athleticism was exciting. I always think it's okay to take a gamble on athletic wings in the draft. In this case, it did not work out. He has been waived. And that means right this second, as I'm talking, the Pacers do have a compliant roster for the regular season. They have 15 players on standard contracts and 3 players on two-way deals. Thumbs up, right? In theory, they could be done. And if I wanted to, I could say Cole Swider got the 15th spot. I'm not going to say that yet because there's still another preseason game, and you never know what's going to happen elsewhere in the league. You learn a lesson when someone like Trevelin Queen gets waived in Philly and the Pacers scoop him up, a couple days already into camp, and he's hurt. He can't play in camp for the Pacers anyway, but things can always be tweaked, right? We just saw, I guess I could say this now as part of this, Doug McDermott's going to go to the Kings, right? That got announced today, an ex-Pacer. And that's relevant because the Kings just made a trade. They dumped Jalen McDaniels onto San Antonio, right? So suddenly Jalen McDaniels is available. And Doug McDermott's like, rosters are not settled. So right this second, if you made me say, do the Pacers keep 15? I'd probably say yes. And if their 15th guy, the best shot to be that person is Cole Swider. But teams have to cut all sorts of guys in the next 4 or 5 days to get their rosters ready for the regular season. So I don't think it's safe to say the Pacers are done, even though it's somewhat likely that this could be their team for the regular season. After the Brown waiver, if they keep Cole Swider, they're $433,000-ish under the tax. And a reminder of what Rick Carlisle said is that it's possible a two-way guy gets the last roster spot, right? Enrique Freeman's playing very well. And like I said on the roster battle segment on Monday's show, if you just ranked the Pacers roster 1 to 18 now, of the guys left, Freeman has certainly played like he belongs in that top 15. So it's not settled yet what their team will look like and who's on what deal, but Kendall Brown being waived certainly puts them very close to potentially being done. And Cole Swider's chances of being on the team certainly went up, and he's played pretty well, right? He showed exactly why they hoped that he could be a guy who merits an actual spot on the roster. He shot it well. He's showed more dribbling chops than I expected when I did the season preview for him. That was one of my questions for him, and I've actually been pretty intrigued by the fact that he can do that. Not that he should be in the rotation or anything, but has certainly showed something. So that is the state of the Pacers roster. I still don't necessarily know that I'd go as far as say, yeah, they're done. This is it. But I would probably guess that this would be their team. If you made me guess right now, I would guess that this would be their team heading into the season, unless there's a shocking waiver. Maybe they love Jalen McDaniels. Who knows? He's an all right player who had a nice stint in Charlotte a couple years ago. It hasn't been kind of the same sense. We'll see. We'll pump the brakes and figure it out from there. Also in the same press release as the Kendall Brown waiver, Jahlil Okafor in and out. He was signed to an Exhibit 10. They had their camp day, and then he was waived. The Mad Ants already owned Jahlil Okafor's rights. They got it in a trade with the Valley Suns like a month-ish ago. I can't remember exactly when that went down. So he'll get a nice, presumably a bonus to now be with the Mad Ants and potentially grow and try to get back in the league. He has played a preseason game with the Hawks in 2021, hasn't been in the league since, was pretty good for the Mexico City Capitanes in the G League a few years ago. So Jahlil Okafor will have a chance, if he takes it and plays it, to be with the Mad Ants, I assume, because he signed Exhibit 10. That is his plan, to try to rehab his value and get back into the NBA. But note, he will not spend any time with the Pacers in training camp. He will not be a part of the blue and gold unless he's awesome for the Mad Ants. And I reported that when I reported the signing, but I don't think many people caught that part of it was true. Either way, that is the status of the Pacers roster moves. If Cole Swider plays one more solid preseason game, I would expect that he would be the guy to get the last spot, but we'll see what other teams do around the league. Kendall Brown just did not do enough this summer to earn it. If he had a good summer league, if he had a good camp, if he had maybe in a better preseason, although he didn't get many chances, perhaps he would have been the guy to stick around. I get why they gambled on an athletic wing. Some people had him mocked in the first round that year, if you remember. A lot of people did, really. It just did not work out. Such is life with 48th picks and later. They did trade stuff to get him. They clearly had some belief in him. They gave him chances. A shin injury really changed things for him, and I think they made the same decision I would have made as of right now to move on. Doing it before the end of the preseason presumably gives him time to turn around and try to find something else for the season. We'll see what his immediate goals and decisions may be. Still only 21, right? Has a chance to potentially grow into something. We'll see. But that is the status of the Pacers roster. Now, let's talk with Pat Boylan about the Pacers and their direction and continuity and the fever and Caitlin Clark and the stunning number of parallels between the two franchises. It's unbelievable right now. Pat's the best. I chat with him super often because he also covers both teams. Really fun conversation you guys will enjoy. Let's get to it. Before we do that, though, we need to talk about the lovely people over at FanDuel. NFL fans, back tonight, Thursday Night Football. You can keep the regular season action rolling with a big return of your own over on FanDuel. They are America's #1 sports book. So when you get that hunch, it's the middle of the game, there it is. Well, you got to make sure you know what's going on in the game so you can view live play-by-play on FanDuel's app. And you need to know who's playing well and who isn't. You can check out the latest stats in the game right on FanDuel and so much more. And all of that information is on the exact same page where you'll place your bet so your hunch can be as informed and well-timed as possible. Plus, when you place your first $5 bet on FanDuel, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, and that's guaranteed. $5 bet, $200 in bonus bets. Act on your hunches with wonderful pages on FanDuel. That is all on FanDuel.com. Our yearly chat doing both teams because very few people have the range of Pat Boylan to talk some Pacers and Fever. We'll open with Pacers. We'll get to Fever. But really, in a lot of ways, it's the same conversation. They're similar teams. You've heard him everywhere, including here before. He's Pat Boylan. He does sideline work for the Pacers and radio work for the Pacers and play-by-play work for the Fever. Pat, did I get it all? How are you? Are you hanging in there? Are you ready for the NBA to start? Do you wish you had more of a gap because the Fever actually made the playoffs? I have so many questions about your personal life.
You got it all correctly. First of all, I apologize for not being on camera here. You gave me the time to do this in more than enough time for me to get that done, but I got caught a little bit behind at practice today. So I'm watching you, and you look great, and then me, which is a little icon, and I know that's not the most entertaining thing for people to watch or listen, but hopefully I will be able to be entertaining and informative enough from an audio perspective. Always good when the two teams are crossing over, right? It means one is in the playoffs and having a successful season. And while there wasn't literal crossover with the Fever into Pacers this year, with the season going longer due to the Paris Olympics, and then also the Fever making the playoffs, yeah, it's a quick turnaround. But always good when that's the case. I'll always take it. And, yeah, good to be back with you. I think the last time we were here, we were talking about a couple of franchises who feel like they're in similar positions, albeit the Pacers maybe a step or two ahead. And I think the Fever have taken a couple of significant steps since the last time I was on with you. And there's probably some pretty interesting parallels between the two teams now.
Yeah, they're just sharing front office members now. It's a pretty smooth gig they got going between the Pacers and Fever these days. We will, of course, this is Locked On Pacers, start with the Pacers. And I want to ask you something that I've been thinking about, but haven't really hammered out. And if this actually matters, right? So I've been covering the Pacers in some capacity since their playoff series against the Cavs with Paul George on the team. That was his last series with the franchise. And I cannot remember if they've had higher expectations for a season in my time. I want to say that the year after Vic was All-NBA and that team pushed Cleveland to 7 and they added Tyreek Evans, that team had pretty lofty expectations, and they were really good. They were top 3 in the East until Oladipo got hurt. But I think this might be the most anticipated in terms of potential for wins and success season they've had in my time. I'm curious if you feel the same way in that stretch I just described. And if so, do you feel like that matters? Because I do feel like sometimes expectations can kind of change the feel of a team, even though the last team I just mentioned that high expectations did very well and was overcoming them until every single player got hurt at some point over a 2-year span.
Yeah, I've had that same kind of thought in my head too. Is this the highest expectations they've had since probably the 13-14 season? And I think I would go with yes. There was a lot of excitement going into the year after Oladipo being All-NBA and taking Cleveland to 7. But that was a year where, while the Pacers that year ran into some bad luck in the playoffs and maybe ran into some good luck last year, it still was a first-round exit. So I think when you make the Eastern Conference Finals, that just naturally brings expectations up. Of course, the Pacers caught a break or two along the way, but nothing that anybody could control, and they took advantage of those breaks. And I think you combine that with, look, Oladipo was really, really good. You said it. He was all NBA, but I think even the most ardent of Pacers and Oladipo fans probably knew that he was not going to turn into maybe a top 10 player. And I think the ceiling for Haliburton is that. And so I think that also adds some of the mix to this. And I think you looked at that team and everything just fit together so well for that year. And really even the next year when he got hurt, they were still a team with a really good record that went to the playoffs. But the addition of Siakam, now you've got a couple of all-stars. It feels like the ceiling for to this team is higher for me, and so I do think those expectations are a bit higher. And it's a weird dichotomy because I think on one hand, I would probably say that these are the highest expectations from 13-14, yet you know this, you talk to some of the players, and one of the first things out of Tyrese Haliburton's mouth on media day was the fact that they feel like they're a little bit disrespected because maybe everybody around the league didn't view that as the same Eastern Conference Finals type run that Boston had or that the two in the Western Conference had. So it's this weird, to me, dichotomy of, yes, expectations as high as they've been here in a long time, but there also still kind of feels like a prove-it attitude to me just because of how some viewed that run the Pacers had last April and into late May.
Yeah, their ceiling is just enormous this year, right? And I think the reason externally Haliburton can get this motivation is the East went crazy with moves, right? Like the Bucks actually got stuff. They have a new coach. The Sixers went nuts. They have a new star and re-signed Maxey, and the Knicks have like a whole new starting 5 dynamic with 2 stars themselves. And all of a sudden it's like, whoa, the East looks way different. That's not good for the Pacers, who had a winning record against the Sixers last year and the Bucks last year and the Knicks last year. Right. And I get what happened in the playoffs, but I get also the Pacers being like, we were good too, guys. Like we did this. Yeah. And so their ceiling is immensely high when they have the offense they do. I think the difference for me between the second year of the Depot era, which what could have been that year, was so fascinating. I would have loved to see that team actually play a series. And this year's team is that team. Yeah, they added Tyreek Evans. I think McDermott too. I might have missed that one earlier, but the continuity aspect this time is different because this year's team is so young that that's why I think, at least you and I and locally, the feeling is that they can reach at least some sort of height and deserve high expectations, because all it takes is one of the young players to get better. Even if everyone else is exactly the same as last year, that is in theory a better team. Obviously there's all sorts of shifting NBA dynamics, as you know, from year to year, but on paper that makes too much sense, right? And last year's team just made the conference finals, even if they did have some favorable help along the way. So I think that has merited high expectations. And I think 13-14 is right in terms of the last year that people truly believed that, that height of ceiling was possible for the Pacers. But it'll be fascinating to see if they can reach it in a talented East and with a group that is still kind of figuring themselves out. They're inserting 2 new lottery picks not new, but 2 lottery picks into this who didn't play from March 5th onward last year, which adds an interesting element to the season that, like, usually you're not introducing young lottery picks into a team that has these high expectations. So I find this season to be fascinating in that way.
No, I agree. And I think how they handle those expectations will be an interesting storyline in of itself. Last year's team didn't even make going into last year, that team didn't even make the play-in tournament. And I think a lot of us were saying, a good goal for this group might be, can they find their way into the playoffs through the play-in tournament? And obviously, if you can be 7 or 8, that makes things a whole lot easier. I don't know that 10th necessarily would have been viewed as a positive if they didn't make the playoffs that way. But I think there were certainly ways for last year's team to take that next logical step where they don't make the playoffs, or where they maybe end up in a 7 or 8 and that first round series is tough. And so it feels like, in a good way to me, that last year's team skipped a step, but with that comes, expectations and not being able to necessarily go into some arenas. I think the Pacers probably caught everybody's attention pretty early because they went on that in-season tournament run and had the success that they did have. And so if anything, that probably nullified some of the surprise factor. But I still think this is the first time you go into a year in a long time not feeling like the underdog, feeling like the team that nobody believes in. Even if you don't have those type of expectations or belief around the NBA, the Pacers, all you have to look at is the national TV schedule. They got a lot of respect there. So I do think how this team handles that. Pascal Siakam's been a part of a championship team, so I think he helps a lot with that. This is Tyrese Haliburton's first time leading a team that's fully expected to make the playoffs. And as you touched on, the expectations for this group should absolutely be high because of what they did last year in the regular season too. Even if the playoff run doesn't go as well as it does, those expectations are still high. Young players, which potentially continue to push this group forward, but at the same time, there might be 8 teams in this conference. I would say 7, maybe 8, that if you said at the end of the day ended up making the Eastern Conference Finals. I don't know that I would be shocked. Some more than others, sure. But this is kind of a wide open field. I think Boston is unquestionably still at the top until something proves otherwise there. But you ran through a lot of them. I don't need to repeat, some of the offseason moves. The East, I think, got a lot better. And I think the Pacers, while continuity is certainly the theme, I guess, going into the season, there's a lot of reason to think that continuity can allow them to take that next step forward. So, I think a lot of teams are probably feeling where the Pacers are right now in the Eastern Conference, which is quietly confident and with high expectations and with a lot of pressure. There's a ton of pressure in Milwaukee. There's a ton of pressure in Philadelphia. Pacers don't have that level of pressure where they have to win right now, but they're, I think, certainly going to feel a little bit of that for the first time in a long time, and for many of these players for the first times in their careers.
Yeah, Giannis and Embiid's age versus Haliburton's age changes that very dramatically. You nailed my transition to the continuity part of this because, if you trek back into the Sabonis Depot teams, the Sabonis Levert teams or whatever, a couple things that mattered to me were that team finished 4th in the East one year. That's really good. They would have had home court, but they were in the bubble. Mm-hmm. And then they didn't have close to this high of expectations the following year because they were so embarrassed by the Heat in the playoffs. And that happened to them twice in a row, getting swept. So the playoff success, I think, is a big part of this, but continuity also plays a factor in these expectations, which is interesting because the same kind of thing happened with that Sabonis team where the cap barely went up, right? The league wasn't making as much money because they weren't playing in front of fans and all that. And so they had basically the same team 2 years in a row, and they traded Depot early in that year, but that year continuity didn't feel warm and fuzzy for the Pacers, and then they finished 34 and 38. And this time everybody, including the team internally, is very excited about what it could add. And I think a lot of the discussion is about early season and how it can help you be off and running, which we've already heard the Pacers talk about in practice. But what to you will be the advantage of continuity for the Pacers, and why do you think, if you do, that it will work better than it did when they tried it 4 or 5 years ago, albeit with an older team?
Well, I think the hope is exactly that you hit the ground running at a higher level than you did last year. If you remember last year, I remember talking about this on the podcast that I do with TV host and sideline reporter Jeremiah Johnson. At the time, so often during those first few weeks, and in fact, Rick Carlisle more or less said, drew a line in the sand on the early season schedule and said, we need to make sure we take care of business through X games. I think the number was maybe the first 16, where they had a bunch of them at home and they were playing a lot of the bottom of the pack teams. And if you remember, the Pacers didn't get off to that great of a start. They did initially. Like, it depends on, I guess, where you draw that line. Right out of the gates, they were pretty good. But they stumbled some into November. And I remember looking at that first quote unquote line in the sand thinking, they didn't really take advantage of this. I think they might have been 9-7 or 9-8 through that stretch, wherever it was, where you hope to maybe separate a little bit. The irony of last year's team, of course, was that they did so good against some of the top teams in the NBA and against the plus 500 teams, and they didn't take advantage at the level they would have liked to with the sub 500 teams. Well, you go into this year and
nice way of putting that, Pat, yes.
It feels like the 180 of it, because you got a couple road games right off the bat, more road than home, more difficult than easy. So you're going to be tested right away, which I think it's probably good you have this more veteran roster and or a group that has continuity and some chemistry right off the bat, because I think they are going to really be tested. And I think it's possible that, you know, as we're looking at this team in late November, that they maybe don't have the record that they might hope to have just because the schedule is so hard. But if they can weather that early season storm with a decent record, I think they'll be in a good spot to start making a charge into December and on the turn of the calendar. So I do think how the Pacers open up this season is going to be important, because you don't want to fall into too deep of a hole. And I would assume the numbers bear this out. I guess I've never really done any research or any study on it, but teams that bring most players back on a team that was pretty good the year before, I would guess, tend to do pretty well in the first 3, 4, 5 weeks of the season. And so we'll see if that trend continues here with the Pacers.
Yeah, the number for me is I don't know what Rick's going to be, but my number's 13 is for their start of the season. 7 of those on the road, and in that stretch, New York twice, Philly, Boston, and Orlando and Miami twice. You talk about what the East standings might be at the end of the season, like that's as big as it gets for a stretch, right? So even if they're 7-6, which does not sound awesome, that's a really good start, because one, that it's a tough stretch of opponents, but two, then from November 18th to December 8th, their next 12 games feature, let's call it easier opponents to be nice about that stretch of time. So that's what I think it will be to me, as a watermark of like, okay, continuity helped them. If they're even over 500 after 13, I think they'll be like, yep, this is great. We got our advantage out of the way, and now we're ready to run because the schedule eases up. Everybody, short little break. We got to talk about the great folks over at Hims. Guys, ever feel like you need a little boost in the bedroom? It's time you stop worrying about your performance and get Hims so you can feel confident knowing you can be ready whenever you're in the mood. Hims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. Hims is providing access to a range of doctor-trusted ED treatments like chewable hard mints and Viagra and Cialis and their generics for up to 95% cheaper. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for those uncomfortable doctor's visits. You just answer a series of questions on their sites, and a medical provider will determine the right treatment option for you. No insurance is needed, and one low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. Start your free online visit today at hims.com/lockdown. That's hims.com/lockdown for your personalized ED treatment options. hims.com/lockdown. Speaking of hard schedules to open the season, Pat, we both covered the Fever this past year. Was that brutal. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I do want to talk about is the path that they are now on. Because last time we compared their path and the Pacers, we were like, oh, they have these spunky young players and lottery picks. And I think it was pre the Caitlin lottery the last time we did this conversation. I mean, what we just heard Kelly Krauskopf, who went from the assistant GM of the Pacers to the president of the Fever, again, talking about similarities she sees between just Tyrese and Caitlin and building a team around those players. But I mean, isn't it remarkable how many parallels those two teams have right now?
Yeah, and I want to even, look at this maybe even in a broader scope than that, because if you go back a couple of years ago at the end of that Karis LeVert, Domantas Sabonis run, I mean, things just felt so stuck in the mud from a Pacers perspective, like they were just totally stuck and under 500, not a playoff team. And the Fever, around that time, were coming off maybe their worst season in franchise history. I think were 5-31, and then you look a year ahead, which is a year ago-ish, you've had the number one pick on the Fever side. You've added Aaliyah Boston. You've won 8 more games the next year. And then on the Pacers side, you've gotten Tyrese Haliburton. And while the wins aren't coming in abundance yet, you've got a direction and a young potential superstar to build around. And I remember thinking, like, wow, for how stuck those two teams seemed, what a difference a year and a half has made for both franchises. And then you do that exercise again to right now, and you're saying the exact same thing.
Right.
The Fever have added Caitlin Clark, a generational talent who's never had who's come into the WNBA with a spotlight and a fan base that has never been before touched in WNBA history, selling out every single home game, selling out every single road game. She's the 4th best player in the league, according to the voters, as a rookie. The Fever win 7 more games. They make the playoffs. And then on the Pacers side, we've just been talking about it, a team that made the Eastern Conference Finals. So it just really strikes me how we had that conversation, and then it was almost like double down, win another bet. And here you are again 365 days later, and you're like, wow, how much a difference a year has made for both of those teams. And now you hope that both start to get in contention mode. Now, by definition, you make the Eastern Conference Finals and you contend it, at least in my opinion. But to be a team that's regularly thought of from the Pacers side as one that could contend for a title. Are they there yet? At least right now, I'm not sure they're quite there yet. I think at least for this current group, without any moves to get there, it probably revolves around Tyrese Haliburton, continuing to move into that superstardom category for the Nembhards and the Mathurins and the Jarris Walkers and the Ben Shepherds of the world. You're probably realistically not going to get all 4 of those to take leaps, but can 1 or 2 of those guys take a leap? Maybe that's how you enter that conversation on the Pacers side. And then on the Fever side, you've just got to continue to build some depth, because I think you have the main pillars in place. As long as you can get Kelsey Mitchell back, you add that with Caitlin Clark and Aaliyah Boston, and more depth and another year under their belts, and I think they're in a really good spot too. And it just strikes me, for one franchise 2 years ago and for another franchise 2.5 years ago, how down things were. And now we're talking about teams that are coming off, for the Pacers, their best season in a decade. For the Fever, they had a great year in 2015, where they almost went to the finals. But in some ways, the best season in franchise history, top to bottom, that the Fever have had, if you look at other metrics. So, hey, I hope we're talking at this time next year and doing that same equation in that same upward trajectory.
If they keep doubling down, what could happen by like the 2027 version of this? Like a combined roster.
Maybe we're talking about a championship parade for both teams. Who knows?
Pat, can the Pacers go 82-0 and the Fever go 44-0 in the same season? That'll be our 3 years from now conversation. I think the parallels are fascinating on the court too, because I mean, just from a contractual perspective, I have no idea what the future of these franchises and players are. Like, we're at it probably at least 6 years more of a top 3 offense for both teams in their league. I mean, the Fever were the best offense from, I forget what the exact date was, June 15th, basically, to the end of the season last year. Yeah. The Pacers were second until the Celtics passed them first for the whole season until the Celtics passed them near the end. And then they were the best offensive team in the postseason, right? And their point guards are a huge part of that, if not all of that, in many cases. And so they're at slightly different spots, I guess. I mean, they were both the 6th seed, which I think is interesting, but you've been around both. They're at just slightly different spots, or it feels like the Fever need their whatever version of the Siakam trade or getting vets in the door. And it's their first time not having a lottery pick since 2017. So certainly lots of shifting sands coming for them this offseason, and a new CBA is coming, which just happened to the NBA also. Right. But they're like the half season behind the Pacers, I would say right now. But I think they have a lot more room to go up this year than the Pacers do in terms of room to go up, even though I both think for the next 5 years at least, these teams are going to be really good and be postseason mainstays with chances to do much more because of their star guards. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I don't want to do too much W free agency stuff, especially because who knows what the heck the expansion draft is going to look like. But the Fever, if they add a forward or a shooter that really helps them, I can see them having a season like the Pacers did last year, next year, where they are capable of reaching that kind of high.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, you touched on just how ridiculously lucky fans in this market are to get to watch
Amazing.
the best passing guard in the NBA. I'll still say guard in there because Nikola Jokic still exists. But the best passing guard in the NBA is 24, and he's on Indiana. And the best passing guard in the WNBA is 22, and she's on Indiana.
Best passer period in the W. There's no W Jokic.
Yes. Good call. Best passer period in the W. Best passing guard at minimum. You can make a case, I think, for Tyrese over Jokic, not as a player, but just as a passer. I think you can make a case. But best passing guard, and they're both so young, and they're both in on long-term deals, and they're both powering the two offenses in the way that they are. You ran through the numbers. I mean, you've got two of the best young offenses in the league. And for the Fever perspective, I think where you really noticed themselves versus some of the top teams in the WNBA when they play, of course, the experience factor. Caitlin Clark is your best player, and she's 22. And Aaliyah Boston is either your second or third best player, and she's also 22. So a lot of people don't realize they're only a few months apart, Aaliyah and Caitlin, in terms of age. And Kelsey, who is a vet, hasn't played in any playoff games until the ones that they were just in. So you could notice that. So I do think that's something that they'll try to get a little bit more veteran experience. But the other, to me, was just depth. When the Fever's 5 was on the floor versus other teams' 5, they were as good as just about anybody. I'm not saying they're at New York's level or Vegas's level talent-wise yet, but they could compete with anybody. It was then when you went deeper into some of their rotations where you started to notice the depth on other teams that the Fever don't have. So now Kelly Krauskopf enters the picture, and can you build depth? And I do agree. I think you need maybe a dynamic 4 or a 3 or a really good shooter somewhere in there. That's where you can maybe take the next significant step forward. And then just building out the type of roster that, frankly, has the depth that the Pacers have. The Pacers have great depth. The Fever don't yet have great depth. And when you look at the parallels between the two teams, to me, that is one significant difference.
You nailed the playoff struggles for the Fever to me. Like game 2 against Connecticut, their entire bench combined played like 21 minutes, I think. Whereas both players who got in off the bench for the Sun played more than that, right? Like they just were at a depth disadvantage there. And then experience, the Fever were ahead with a minute 50 to go. And if you want to say that's where playoff experience matters, that final 2 minutes, well, guess what? The Suns veterans who have been there, done that a million times, were awesome in the last 2 minutes of that game, and Connecticut moves on. Next year, the Fever, assuming they make it, would get a home playoff game. They'll have experience. I think it will go much different, and they won't, presumably, knock on wood, start 1-8 with like a comically stupid, can I say that now that the season's over? A stupid schedule. That was so dumb. It was so dumb that I told people before the first game, even though I think this team's going to be better this year, I think they're going to start 2-8 because this is crazy. It was crazy.
Yeah, and if nothing else, I'm really looking forward. I appreciate going on any of the talk show hosts locally or nationally, but man, I felt like a firefighter trying to put out flames for the first
I did the same thing
of the year. And because there's all of this newfound attention, and I told, especially the local stations, I said, hey, look, I love that you're talking Fever every single day, and I love that you're disappointed. But I need to explain to you the ridiculous perspective that's going on here. And you got to give this team a chance to play 9 or 10 games in quote unquote the normal WNBA. Then they did. Everything changed. The team did a 180. We know how it finished. But yeah, I mean, you get a normal schedule out of the gates, and I think that'll be really helpful. And but it's funny because you talk about the two parallels between the teams. The Pacers don't have quite that tough of a schedule here out of the gates, but they do have a really tough schedule out of the gates too. And how you manage that? Look, 1-8 is not how you want to start, even with that difficulty of a schedule. But putting yourself in that big of a hole comes with real challenges too. I mean, the Fever needed to play as well as they did to get back into contention. They did it, but that's not an easy thing to do because you have to be a lot closer to perfect, or at least your team's version of perfect to get there. So the Fever dug themselves in a hole. They dug themselves out. Ideally, the Pacers won't have to do that same thing, but it is something to watch here, something to hopefully try to avoid right out of the gates.
Felt very good doing the same thing as you with all the new people talking about the Fever on the radio locally, being like, just call me back on 4th of July. Okay. Like I can also see the record. Just call me in a month. If it's still bad, we'll rehash. And I was right. It turns out that playing easier teams is much easier for basketball teams. Pat, this was great. I will not take much more of your time because I'm sure you're the busiest person on the planet right now. Also, with the season in a week, 1 week, Pacers play real games. Where can people find you and the 10 million things you do for the pro basketball teams here in Indiana?
Well, I appreciate it, and everybody who watches and follows your work knows that you are equally busy, but it's a good thing to be busy about. So I'm on the Pacers Radio Network, so I do the Pacers Radio pregame show, which starts 30 minutes before each game. Realistically, if you're sitting around in your house, I know that you're watching Jeremiah Johnson on television, but if you're out and about in the car, pop us on 30 minutes before the game. That's when we start on the radio. Mark Boylan, Eddie Gill then get underway with the radio play-by-play. Once the ball goes up, and as you can see, you've got my at Pat Boylan Pacers down there. So that's me on Twitter, and we're looking forward to another year here. This is year 11 for me, which is hard to believe because I still kind of am holding on to the concept of youth, but it's evading me. It's really hard for me to say this is year 11 and then argue that I have any of that. But I am extremely grateful to be doing this for my 11th season with the Pacers. And man, I know it's cliche, but time has really, really flown. It's crazy to believe that this is already year 11, but hopefully we've got an interesting season ahead and one where we're going into May and who knows, maybe even June come 2025.
Pat, you didn't ask for suggestions, but as not your boss and not your coworker, I would like to suggest that it might be time to change your Twitter handle.
Yeah, so I did look into that, and somebody, and I have a suspicion, took Pat. I was going to switch it to Pat Boylan Fever during Fever season, and then just switch
Somebody did it
back and forth. Somebody's taken Pat Boylan Fever, and there just weren't any iterations that worked. So if you see my handle, I admit it's a little obnoxious, but I wanted to make it clear to kind of this newfound audience we have. My actual name, not the handle, but the name is Pat Boylan Fever /Pacers, because I didn't want there to be confusion there that I don't cover Fever or Pacers. And of course, the biggest job that I do is Fever. So the Pacers handle goes back to the 2014-2015 season when I started, and I wasn't doing a whole lot of Fever then. And then we got the check marks, and then you couldn't change it. And then now the check marks went away, or you have to pay for them or whatever. And I can change it, but by this point, for some reason, a bunch of people have snatched the other ones, and I haven't found a great solution. So this is what I'm doing, and I guess I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, when the check marks went away, I immediately got the NBA out of my handle. I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, that was well done, and I tip my cap to you because your transition in the non-check mark era, I think, went better than mine, but mine's sort of like a Band-Aid covering a larger wound versus you actually healed up. So props to you.
And there's about 3 people in the world who actually care about this. So this is a riveting discussion. And
well, we've got 2 of them right here. So that's all that matters.
Yeah, that's right. Time to get people out of here. Tomorrow, of course, talking Pacers Hornets. Whatever happens on this very podcast, maybe we get to see more of the Pacers players playing in that game. Johnny Furphy on the mend. Starters may be playing. Hopefully the Pacers can get off to a better start so there's not as much doom and gloom about their first quarters entering the season. Pat, thank you for the time. Everybody, thank you for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.